and I give the floor to the Russian Federation. Thank you, Madam President. We're grateful to Madam Nakamitsu and Ambassador Zlaunin for their briefings. Madam President, we, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to spare future generations from the scourge of war. Those are the words that are at the beginning of the charter of our organization. And just a week and a half after the signature of that charter was the nuclear explosion, the first and last, we hope, of the nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That spelled the start of the arms race, and its consequences are still being felt. Almost 25 years have been necessary to meet that challenge in the form of the Non-proliferation Treaty, which we will mark the 50th anniversary of a few days from now. In the half century since its existence, the NPT has demonstrated that it is one of the cornerstones of the international world order, and its contribution to ensuring international peace and security is difficult to overestimate. The unlimited extension of the NPT achieved in 1995 is proof of how important it is, and the fact that the treaty is in the interest of all states parties, both nuclear states and non-nuclear states. Madam President, lately we have witnessed the breakdown of a number of internationally accepted mechanisms in the area of non-proliferation and arms control. The core reason for this, as we see it, is the attempts by one state to dominate the world and to impose on the international community its rules at the expense of the interests of other states and of international law. All multilateral agreements and mechanisms which hinder this kind of domination are declared as obsolete and ineffective. The starting point here can be considered the exit by Washington in 2002 of the very important Anti-Ballistic Missile Defense Treaty, ABM Treaty, which was extremely important. Last year, the USA, under a bogus pretext, tore up the INF Treaty. Practically immediately after that, flight tests of earlier banned American systems were started. Our proposal to impose a moratorium on medium-range and short-term ballistic missile systems, including with a mechanism to verify it, has been ignored by the USA and its allies, and even undermined. These actions confirm that the real reasons for the collapse of the INF are not at all linked to the positions or actions of Russia. We're also very concerned about the lack of clarity with regard to the future of the START agreement. The extension of the agreement would be a sensible step which would make it possible to prevent a further deterioration of the situation in the area of strategic stability and avoid a full collapse of the control and limitation mechanisms in the missile sphere, and win time to discuss methods and approaches of control to new types of weapons and weapon technologies. Appeals to Russia to extend the START are really misguided. President Putin has proposed to extend the START to the USA without any preconditions. We're still awaiting an answer. Madam President, now in the past, in the area of non-proliferation, the the nuclear agreement with Iran was a huge success. 5 years ago, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was signed, which was unilaterally approved in Resolution 2231 of the Security Council. This was an example of an effective overcoming a crisis which threatened to become a real conflict. Now, it was possible to achieve a breakthrough when the interested parties expressed a readiness to truly listen to each other and to take into account mutual interests. However, today we see that this unique achievement of multilateral diplomacy is threatened as a result of the refusal of the United States to uphold its international legal obligations under the UN Charter. against the backdrop of the official refusal of the USA to ratify the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and in conditions of continuing American deployment of nuclear weapons on the territory of certain NATO allies, Washington is once again significantly lowering the threshold in its doctrinal approaches to regarding the use of nuclear weapons. It is lowering the threshold for the possible use of nuclear weapons. At the same time, NATO states continue the practice of so-called joint nuclear missions, which include elements of nuclear planning and developing skills for the use of nuclear weapons with the involvement of representatives of non-nuclear states. This is a direct contravention by nuclear states, members of NATO, of Article 1 of NPT, and by non-nuclear states of Article 2 of the treaty. Another example recently was this month when the U.S. and its European allies conducted exercises with the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons on the territory of the Russian Federation. In the interest of lowering the artificial tension created and maintaining possibilities for strategic dialogue, a year and a half ago, we proposed to Washington to at least confirm the earlier and strengthen the formula of Gorbachev and Reagan that in a nuclear war there can be no victor and it should never be started. We have still not received any answer from the U.S. Madam President, we understand the concerns of a number of non-nuclear states regarding the increasing demands for accelerating the process of nuclear disarmament. We have examined and continue to examine this topic as one of the priorities of our foreign policy. However, we need to take into account all factors of international security and strategic stability. The forceful actions by the United States and NATO undertaken over the past few decades, as well as the threats by Washington against a number of states, including Russia, only make it more difficult to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons. What we need are consistent approaches that make it possible to move forward on the path of nuclear disarmament. This requires first and foremost to improve the strategic situation in certain regions and in the world as a whole. This is only possible taking into account all the variety of factors that have an impact on strategic stability and international security. These factors include reducing limiting the deployment of anti-missile defense systems by the United States, development of highly accurate strategic offensive weapons that are not armed with nuclear weapons, the possibility of deploying offensive weapons in space, undermining systems of international agreements in the area of security, stability, attempts to weaken the defense capacity of certain states using illegitimate means, and unilateral sanctions outside the Security Council. Without resolving the issues I mentioned, it would hardly be possible to achieve international security, a state of international security which would be conducive to further steps in nuclear disarmament. Madam President, a separate role in the framework of the NPT has always been the issue of creating a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East, as provided for in the resolution of the review conference of the NPT of 1995. We expect that the conference, the nuclear weapons free zone, the first of which in the Middle East, the first of which took place in November 2019, will ultimately lead to a final result, creating such a nuclear weapons free zone in the Middle East. We will continue to contribute to this in every way possible. And what's most important, that the other members of the nuclear quintet, and most importantly the countries of the Middle East, also take part in these efforts. Madam President, we consider IAEA guarantees as a key element of non-proliferation. The goal of not allowing the use of nuclear energy for for the creation of nuclear weapons. That is our goal, and we intend to support the IAEA in achieving and strengthening this system of guarantees. At the same time, it's important to maintain the objective, unpoliticized, and technical character of the control mechanism of the NPT. And I think that there's general consensus on this among parties. Madam President, today it's important to join efforts of all states parties to the NPT, both nuclear states and non-nuclear states, in order to ease tensions and confrontation. It's important that the review conference of 2020 contribute to strengthening the non-proliferation regime rather than weakening it. In other words, as non-confrontational as possible. As a minimum, states parties must strengthen their overall commitment to the treaty and confirm the obligations they have undertaken in the course of earlier review cycles. Russia is interested in maintaining and improving the regime of nuclear non-proliferation and is ready to actively cooperate with all its participants in the interest of conducting a successful review conference in 2020. Thank you very much.
Je remercie le représentant.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation.